Teaching kids to sew, or anyone. This is part 2. Let's get sewing. On to the good stuff. Well, in part 1 video of teaching a child to sew, or anyone, I went over operating the machine, threading the machine, the bobbin, all about the tools to get you ready to sew. Seems it takes a little bit of time to master that tool, and then the actual real sewing is working with fabric and making things. So first you got to get the sewing machine down, get comfortable with it, but you also learn a lot by doing projects. That's why we start with simple projects. Those, just through little projects, you learn more and more. You learn even how to operate and run the sewing machine, how to work with the fabric, with different types of fabrics in the sewing machine. It's all a process. So the first thing I like to show my students is what a seam allowance is. So what is a seam allowance? In class number 1, I always ask people, do you know what a seam allowance is? And about half of people say, no, I don't know. And the other's like, well, yeah, I think. They think about what the word is, seam and allowance. So I have this little skirt that we make here. It's elastic waist casing hem. So I always say, okay, there's the seam. That's what the sewing machines do. They sew 2 pieces of fabric together 90% of the time, because you can also sew one. Sometimes it's not always together. And then we sew the 2 pieces, usually right sides together, and we make a seam. So this fabric here is the seam allowance. Seam allowance. So once you start understanding that concept, you think, okay, you don't just cut out a piece and sew it together. You always have to have that seam allowance in there, and it's usually different measurements. In most patterns that you get, like at Joann's, the commercial patterns, they have the seam allowances built in. And sometimes the PDFs, you might find the people, they actually say there's no seam allowance in it, and people will just like sew it. They don't, I see a lot. So they don't know that there's a seam allowance built in. And a lot of times when I tell them there's seam allowance built in, they go, oh, really? Like it's like free, but it's actually all planned in the pattern. But this is 5/8 is your basic seam allowance in commercial patterns. So we always show them, like, look, it goes right on the edge, and it's at 5/8 right there. This got pinked a little bit right here. So I have them do seam allowance strips. We'll do like a strip of muslin fabric here. I have them mark it 5/8, and then we also teach to pin. So we'll do pinning to sew, we call it, and the directions of pinning. So we always like it to go out to the left. I pull it out, or pull out to the right, so the fabric is out to the left. Pinning that way, so the pins come out to the right, because then you want to set them onto the right side of the sewing machine so that they're not floating all over the table and then falling in your lap and getting all over the place. So we try to teach the basics on this. It's not mandatory. People will start figuring it out later, but we like to set them up right away to be thinking about how you correctly pin things. We just like also say, do not pin if you're sewing this way down this way, because then you take this pin out, your hand has got to go into the, close to the machine to pull it out. So we show the proper way of pinning. We also show what happens when you sew over pins. So we don't want to sew over pins. This was a needle that literally hit a pin and bent. It didn't break, it bent. And then this was a pin that went into the machine at the bottom. And then here's another one oh, look at this one. Oh boy. So we also say, do not sew over pins. There's sometimes when I'll sew over pins, like when I'm sewing velvet, I'll sew over the pins. Do not sew velvet for a while, because that is a slippery fabric that is not easy. Also, you always want to just be starting with woven fabric. A lot of times when I ask my students, do you know what a difference between woven and knit is? And they don't know. So I'll show them a knit. It's like the stretchy, what most of us wear nowadays. It's simple, easy, comfortable clothes. It's a knit. You need a stretch stitch for that. I'll show them what that is, but I don't have them use that right away. I don't have my students working on knits for a while, till a few intermediate classes later, because it's just it's another headache, and I want them to start understanding the grain lines on fabrics, and working with cotton wovens, which just are easier. Also, flannel is one of the easiest fabrics to work with. It has a little kind of give in it, but it tends to stick together really well. So when you're pinning it, it's just easier to handle. So that's good for kids. So if you're making any little projects like pillows or anything, start with some flannel. If you're making any pants or anything like that later on, pre-wash it, because flannel really shrinks a lot, by the way. So back to the strips. So this is actually one of the seam allowance strips that we were practicing on with a student, and we marked it, the 5/8 inch seam allowance. I don't see the marks here very well. There's little marks there, but we also like to sew with two different color threads, because that'll show us like if there's any problems with the bobbin thread or the top thread. So we just sew a strip right here and get used to like understanding what a seam allowance is and what the measurements are. I also had this from long ago. It says like, what is 5/8 seam allowance? What is a half? What is a quarter? You could do one really good exercise is to do a 5/8 inch seam allowance in one color of thread, change out the machine to a different color, do the 1/2 inch, change it out, do a 1/4 of an inch, do longer strips, and that will help kind of cement the idea of what, different measurements, different seam allowances, like that. So, and also explain seam allowances are that allowance, like if you sewed a real tiny seam, and actually that's actually a good exercise too, to sew a real tiny seam real close to the edge. You might need to do that because that's actually kind of hard to do. And then you pull the fabric and it comes apart. So you actually need the allowance so that the fabric or that whole seam doesn't come apart, right? So that's a seam allowance we start with first, then we go into some projects. Also, while you're teaching seam allowances, show them what happens when you stop the feed dogs from going their rate, I guess you could say. Like you set the machine up, and then the feed dogs move however their speed they're supposed to get you that stitch. But if you hold the fabric down, and it's like the feed that you get these like little tight stitches. So I'll show my students like, okay, we put it on the longest stitch, but if I hold the fabric down, it like stops the feed dogs, and then you get this real tight stitch. So I'll show them that. Make sure your thread is easily visible on whatever fabric you're doing. Like if you're doing black fabric, use white thread, that kind of stuff. But hold it down and show them, then like let it go, and it goes fast. Hold it down, let them go. Because a lot of my students are always like just trying to don't let the fabric go through the whole system, and then they get these real tight stitches. And then if they had to make take it out or anything, they've got these really tight stitches. I can always see where my students are holding down the fabric. So have them go through that a little bit. So practice like pinning a lot, just sewing around and getting used to working on fabric. Then I take them over to the iron and I have them press open the seam allowance strips right here. And I show them different parts of the iron, like the steam, the heat options, the squirt part, which we don't like to use because then the kids start playing with it, but I show them the steam, and also to be careful. Ooh, look at, gotta clean that off. Also to be careful that I have a lot of kids that, they're sewing along and they're not realizing that this is hot, or even the side is hot, and I tell them not to, kind of touch that. I've gotten a lot of burns on the side of my arms, but I teach them a little bit about the iron. Then I show them tools, like we love the sleeve board here. It's the chest board and the sleeve board. I show them how to use it. Like if you want to get a seam right here, you're going to put it through here, press it that way instead of just putting it on a table and crunching it. I show them how to roll things around it, like you roll around, press, roll around, because we use the iron so much in sewing. It's how we control the fabric and set it up to go through the sewing machine well, that you literally have to do a lot of lessons working with the iron. And I have a video all about pressing. I'll put a card up here and take a look at that and using the pressing tools. I also have this, this isn't mandatory. I never had one of these until probably was 5 years ago. It's a pressing block, and it just really helps trap the steam. And a lot of fabrics don't develop a crease unless you let it cool first. So we'll press, let it cool, so that it's with the strong crease that you can set it up to be sewn easier like that. So that explains in the video too. That has to do with a lot of fabrics too. Now, students are always going to get to know their fabrics by every project they do, what fabric they've been used, like polyester or cotton. They start to, learn how to work with it, what it feels like, how it's going to react, all that stuff. So every project just teaches you more. This is a ham. Show them how to, if you're going to curve something, you can steam it this way, and really get them used to using the iron. Because I know when I have students here, and most of my students, they don't even have irons in their homes anymore because, we don't use them as much because we use the knit, so they're not used to the irons. So just really get them used to the iron and watch over them for a while, and then they're on their own. And if they get burnt by it, then they learn not to burn themselves. So you're like, well, that's what happens. But just hopefully they don't run over their fingers, because that's, I'm always watching the little ones like, oh, don't do that, because I've seen that happen a couple times. I had one student that did it twice to herself, so I think probably never ever did it again. But so now, once you get a little accustomed to that, start on some projects. So some simple projects for kids is really starting with pillows. I have a lot of parents who are like, can she make something more than pillows? But kids love to make pillows. So make sure you get some stuffing. I know Walmart sells big bags, 58 ounces. I think that used to be $12. Now it's like 18. But for a while I was thinking, the kids eating this because we're going through all this stuffing. But get some stuffing, some flannel type fabric, not knits, and some just basic cottons too, and just start making square pillows. Then have them do the seam allowances around it. That's where and then also you do the pivoting, where it's like when we did the zigzag on the paper, that's pivoting. So they learn how to put the needle down, pivot it, or see if they can make a perfect square. And also leaving an opening, trimming the seams. It's all like the concept of, turning how things work, turning it inside out. I have a video called the ABCs of Sewing, and I'll put a card up here. It's just kind of the concept of what sewing is about, because I don't think people really think about what's the concept. It's just real quick little ideas on there. But so do some squares, and then we actually take the square part and we turn them into bows. So we'll make like little squares and we crunch them together and make bows. So you can kind of see we also do like stuffed bows. We'll do like bigger squares, lightly stuff it, crunch it in the middle, put a band around it, and they have like a bow pillow, we call it. So that's actually another really fun project. And after you do that, then start making some shapes. We do like circle shapes like these. This was like a little hand held here. And I actually have this. I can put a link below. We turn the circles into animal faces. We might make ears on there. Take a lot of felt. You want to get different color felts, and they can cut out shapes. And then you got hand sewing. So you want to make the circle. They also learn how to clip the curves. I also have a video on what's clipping the curves. I'll put a video up here, and that helps release the fabric so it turns around. So go from squares to circles and just learning different shapes. And then also stuff them and then hand sew from there, because it's easier to get in and out. They get the concept of down, up with hand sewing, because hand sewing is kind of where it all starts. You just got to get the concept of sticking two pieces of fabric together with thread, right? And also handling the needle, because almost in every sewing project there's going to be like, okay, hand sew this part together. So you just got to get to know that also. After you get through to circles, you might want to do triangles like this. I actually have a watermelon pillow. I'll put on the link below. But this is one of my students made a little pizza. So we're like just a triangle and turned it into pizza. I just think this is so cute. It sits up on her thing. Then she made a banana right here. But this could be easy. You can actually just take any shape, like any shape you want, with a star, which would actually be hard with the pivots. You want to do that a little later. Add seam allowance, like are you going to do a 1/4 inch seam allowance or 5/8? I always like to use 5/8 because then they get that kind of ingrained. So when they go on to patterns, that they remember the 5/8, and also your eye gets used to what 5/8 looks like. Pretty soon, like I don't really mark my seam allowances because my eye is like right there. I also use a seam guide on my machine sometimes. Yeah, so just you learn sewing through little projects along the way, and gotta think of learning sewing as like learning anything, like learning a musical instrument, like guitar. If you want to learn guitar, you practice the chords several times a week, if not daily. It's like, okay, let's practice the chords. Or piano. Piano, you go to a half-hour class. I never took piano, but I was always amazed, like half-hour class, you learn something, and then you're expected to go every day practice piano. I have a lot of students that come to sewing class. They do nothing during the week. They come to the next class a whole 8 days later, the next week, and they forget everything because they're not developing their muscle memory at all. So if you really want to learn to sew, you have to do like a little project at least every other day. And it's in the little projects, the simple projects, that you learn. So also if your kid is making a lot of pillows, I see that a lot, and I think they just learn more and more. And when they get bored enough with it, they'll move on to a different shape pillow. But just introduce the circle shapes, get the cute animal faces here, and then find that watermelon pillow, and then you're on to more projects. That's when they start getting really good at that. Maybe get a simple pattern, because that's a whole nother learning curve. Just looking at those instructions, trying to interpret the keys, like right side fabric, wrong side fabric, the cutting layouts, the grain lines on a fabric. That's what a lot of people do not understand or comprehend. I have another video called all about grain lines. That, I believe, is probably key to any successful project. Knowing the grain lines on fabric. That's where knits are so hard, because knits are looped together. However, they're on them. I saw all the machines at North Carolina State University has a textile program that is like amazing, and so they showed this knit machine. It's like it's done in cylinders, and it's hard to get them on grain. Like if you ever have garments that you're wearing and it's sliding around your body, it was cut off grain, and it's so irritating. So if you're actually going to put work into something and you want to get it to look really beautiful, you want to first cut it correctly, be cutting it on the grain. So it's actually a really easy concept. It just takes a little bit of time to comprehend. So check out that video. And I never introduce that to kids right away because it kind of just goes over their head. So I just get them into sewing, seeing if they're loving it, and then later on I start talking about grain lines when they want to go into patterns and stuff. And I also know that it's going to take a little bit of time to fully comprehend. So I just go, okay, there's the word again. This is length grain, cross grain, bias grain. Okay, and then we'll move on, and you'll start to understand it. I hope all these tips helped. How you start learning to sew is you sew. You also want to know you're sewing it correctly, right? That's where you also want to look at is the machine jamming and all. So go back to part 1. I showed some parts on, want to operate the sewing machine correctly, right? And then you just keep sewing, right? So let me know if you have any questions. I'll see you in the next video.